Hello, everyone, and thanks for attending. Today's webinar is titled the 2016 Open Source Risk Report, Key Findings for M&A Professionals. Today's speakers are Phil Odens, VP and General Manager on the on-demand audit side of our business, and then Mike Pittenger, VP of Security Strategy here at Black Duck Software. Before we begin, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions during the webinar, please submit your questions through the Ask a Question section. If you have any audio issues, please click on the Rate This button and click on Not Hearing Audio for section support. Lastly, I'd like to note there are quite a few attachments to this webinar. We have the actual analyst report attached that we'll be discussing today, an infographic that goes with the report, and a link to the Black Duck On-Demand Audit Data Sheet and landing page. Please be sure to check those out. Thank you, and I'll pass it over to Phil to begin the webinar.
Great, thanks, Jane. Just before we kind of dive in, I've noted that a number of you online today are regulars for our webinars, and some webinars sort of range from sometimes conceptual to more concrete. And I think the last few we've been trying to get very concrete. So if you missed it, we did a legal webinar with Mark Radcliffe, who's quite an expert, talking about current litigation that's going on around open source. So not just in concept one could get sued, but actually lawsuits that are going on. Today we're going to be talking about hard data on what we actually find in our audits as part of M&A transactions, and then we've got one coming up. I think it's November 16th, where we're going to be talking about key issues and war stories around those issues in M&A open source diligence. So with that as the background, that said, we'll start with a little bit of conceptual, about 2 or 3 minutes of conceptual, and then we'll to set the stage, and then we'll dive into some of the concrete data that Mike and I will be talking about today. So the open source is used much more today than it was when Black Duck started, which was a little over 10 years ago. And I think that the roots of open source do go back decades, but certainly we've seen an acceleration in the last 5 or 10 years with applications using. Maybe when we started doing audits in 2004, it was unusual for us to see an application that was more than 20% open source, and 5-10% might be more the norm. Today, and we'll be talking about the hard data, but we sometimes see applications that are over 80% open source, and that's with code that we're auditing. I think out there in the enterprise with home build applications, the numbers tend to be even higher. And so, excuse me, as a consequence, and we've got, I've tried to hit forward here, can I, is there a lag? Try again.
I got it.
Okay. So why is it? It's because open source is really good stuff. It comes without the acquisition costs of either development or of commercial components, which is not always up top of everybody's list, but important. More importantly, perhaps, is it leads to more innovation, faster time to market, and another big benefit is if you're picking the right projects where there are busy communities around them, then what you're finding is you're not burdened with all of the support costs. You're sharing that amongst other users of the code. So on the downside, open source is often coming into a company's code base without a lot of scrutiny. And in contrast to the days when purchasing departments were the gate for any third-party commercial code coming into a code base, the abundance and availability of open source means that any developer can get it, bring it in, check it into source control, but not necessarily ask all the questions that a trained purchasing person might around licensing, security, hey, how are we going to support this thing? And as a consequence, you end up with open source components in a code base that have legal issues, security issues, operational issues, and therefore in any code base there are risks in all those areas. And just to exacerbate the problem, management of the software development organization is typically not aware of the specifics of what their developers are using, and even more concretely, the components that are in their code base. We see a lot of examples of this. We've got some data to support that. So open source has gone from being kind of an unusual question to ask or an unusual area of inquiry in due diligence to being pretty much the norm. That doesn't mean a software audit is happening in every transaction where software assets are in play, but it's certainly much more common to have the question asked than not at all. And the reason is that acquirers have legit concerns. Gartner says that less than half of IT organizations have good open source management in place. And I think if that's true across all companies, then it's more true for smaller companies. At least anecdotally, we know it to be the case that bigger, more established companies are more likely to have a reasonable open source management policy and process in place, and smaller companies less so. They've got other things to worry about. Another concern for acquirers is that their deeper pockets may be attractive to somebody who wants to enforce particularly licensing issues. And I think you could make the same argument for security, and we're certainly going to be talking a fair amount about security today, that a larger company may be a more interesting target for a bad actor than a small company. And so what we see in audits that our repeat customers are certainly aware of is lots of open source, and I'm going to be using qualitative terms here that we're going to get quantitative about in a minute, but lots of open source, use of open source that has problematic licenses or unknown licenses, which we'll touch on, use of components with security vulnerabilities, and then what we call operational issues being out of date or unsupported, poorly supported components. And so we've done this hard risk analysis. We looked at 200 applications. This is from going back about a year to about 6 months ago, and then, by the way, we have plans to update this. So little sneak preview. We're planning to later in this quarter update, get more fresh in a broader data set, and we'll be doing another one of these with updated information. But what we found in general is it supported all those statements I made. A lot of open source, much open source people didn't know about, lots of issues. And so that's what we'll be talking about. So we'll first go into some stats on open source usage and awareness of that usage, and then license risk. And when I say we, I'll be talking through that part. And Mike heads up our security strategy, so I'll turn it over to him to talk about security and operational risks. We'll bring it back around to what the implications of all this for M&A professionals, and we should have some time at the end for some questions. Again, just type them as Jenny said, just type them into the question chat. So usage. Today we see about a little over a third, 35% of the code that we look at is open source. And to break that down a little is a bit of a complicated chart, but let's start with the blue line. So the blue line is the percent of the audits we're doing, the percent of applications we're seeing that are less than 20% open source, and that was fairly high 5 years ago, in the 40% range, and it's been trending pretty steadily down to now we only see about 20% of the code bases we look at don't use a lot of open source. At the other extreme is the darker green line, which has gone from 0, and this represents more than 80% open source in the code base. It's gone from 0 up to 10%, fairly significant. And what this all nets out to is sort of a crossover point at this point, where we see roughly a third of the applications we look at are more than 50% open source. The other 2/3 still have, fairly significant amount of open source, and it's almost unheard of for us to find a code base that doesn't have any open source. I think it's simply too hard to do. That a company really has to be sophisticated and work hard to not have any open source. So lots of open source being used, more over time, and then within those applications, we're finding typically more than 100 open source components is the average, and we've certainly seen applications, and it somewhat scales with the size of the application. But sometimes we'll see 500, sometimes it'll be 50. But the average is about 100. More interestingly, perhaps, is that we always ask for the code owners to declare what open source they have. And sometimes we get the answer, I thought that's what you were here for, meaning, read between the lines, they really didn't have a lot of idea. And in fact, in about half the cases, a little more than half the cases, code owners really aren't even comfortable saying, here's what open source we're using. They don't have enough of a handle that they can provide us a list. So a little less than half of the time, we actually get a list. And when we do get a list, it's on average includes about 45% of what we would find in a typical code base. So usually we don't get a list. When we do get a list, if you'd say it's an average code base with about 100 components, the target in an acquisition is telling us of 45 of those components that they know about, and so we're finding another 55 that they didn't know about. So more and more open source being used, and the norm being that the owner of the code base really doesn't have a good idea of what those components are in the code base. And we'll talk in a few minutes about what the components are that we actually see and what the licenses we see. Some of the reason for this is the nature of how software is developed these days. So very little written from scratch, and very little written without components coming from a number of sources. So outsourcing to offshore groups, commercial components being included, something from elsewhere in the company, code reuse from a project you've been on before. And as a consequence, it's not just what your developers are bringing into the code that is the source of the open source, but as well what developers in other parts of that software supply chain have been doing. And so it's a pretty complex problem. Hard enough for a company to get a handle on what their own employees are doing in this regard, but even harder as you work your way back upstream in the software development process. So what are we seeing? And we'll not go through the details. These are the top 20 components we've seen, and this data is actually goes back further and is broader than the data that we did the detailed study on. So the detailed study was across about 200 audits. This is across many more audits. I think well over 1,000 audits going back about 5 years, and so a bit of a lag measure, but kind of interesting. So these are the top components, and without going through them in detail, things to observe. jQuery gets always number one. We see it all the time, very popular under the MIT license. But then a lot of Apache in there. And I guess this is more confirming than surprising, but the most popular components we see use permissive licenses. And I think that's because that is the intention of those components. If the authors of those components are selecting these licenses because they want them to be friendly and used. And when we're auditing, it is proprietary, quote unquote, proprietary code we're auditing for the most part. There's some exceptions, but usually the situation is that it is the code of a target of an acquisition that creates an application or a system. It may be SaaS or it may be distributed. If it's distributed, it's generally under a commercial license. So those are the applications for which the MIT license and the Apache license and the BSD license were really designed. It's to encourage sharing, and that's why you see so many permissive licenses in these top components. And the good news is that these are relatively low risk. Now, all of them have obligations. Even the MIT, which is the simplest, or the BSD, have attribution obligations. You need to, all we're asking, guys, is leave the copyright in. So you have to be wary of that. But those are pretty easy to comply with, and they're not those the biggest concern. I guess the other observation I'll make is for Apache. I do think there's brand recognition and comfort with Apache as being a trusted source. So I think there are, anecdotally, in my observation, there are development organizations that are inclined to go to Apache first when they're looking for an open source component to perform the function they want. So another cut at this is that was component based. This cut is what are the top licenses we actually see across all components. And again, consistent with the previous slide, the top three are the MIT license, the Apache 2, and the BSD. You can get a copy of these slides and you can study this. One of the things you'll see is that there are naming convention issues that would call for, might suggest aggregation. And we're gonna do this in the next round of the study. But if you're familiar with the BSD, there are a few flavors, and this is the flat list. So you'll see the three clause being the most common one we see. But if you run your eye down the list, we see the BSD 2.0 license and the two clause license. So really, if you add those in, the BSD license is up in the teens. As well, the MIT license, there are different flavors of it, and so all of these, these top permissive licenses, the MIT and the Apache, are the most common, and we're seeing upwards of 20% in the case of all of the different flavors of the MIT, or the two flavors of the MIT. We're seeing over 20% of the licenses that we see. Coming in behind that, and I'll talk first about unknown licenses. Unknown licenses are kind of interesting. At least if you've got a reciprocal license, you know what you're dealing with. But we see many audits, certainly more than half the audits we look at, we're finding components that are available on the internet with terms that are very unclear. Oftentimes it's a website with sample code, and the owner of the website, whoever posted that code, did not make their wishes known in any clear way at all. They say, here's some sample code, but there's no reference to a license, there's no terms of service, and a lot of attorneys in the audience, most attorneys would say, gee, if you haven't been given permission, i.e. license, to use this code, there's risk in using it, and to be perfectly clean, you don't want to use it. So we see a lot of that. A little further down the list, we see the GPL General Public License v2.0 or later. Again, we will figure out the best way to aggregate these things next time around. But I've highlighted in red all of the licenses in that top 20 that are in the GPL family. So it includes the LGPL, the Lesser General Public License, which we know is more okay for libraries, but still part of the family. And if you put those all together, now you're at 18%, and that class of reciprocal licenses is kind of right in there with the most popular permissive licenses. So pretty frequent, and we've got some stats about how often these licenses are turning up in code bases. But I guess it gives you a sense. You may have seen other stats from Black Duck. I don't have them in here, but across our entire knowledge base, about half of the open source components out there today are under reciprocal licenses, mostly the GPL family of licenses. But I think we're seeing a biased view, if you will, in looking at these commercial applications from companies being acquired. Certainly companies who are distributing code are wary of the GPL licenses, and so there's some filtering. So it's not surprising to see it being a smaller percentage than that half. And 18% is pretty significant. That's 18% of the component of the licenses we see out there are these problematic licenses that are problematic for companies distributing code anyway. About 17% of the components identified had license conflicts. So why is that smaller than the 18%? Well, in that 18% from the previous slide, I included, say, LGPL, and if LGPL is dynamically linked, it's not a problem, and so that wouldn't have a conflict. That's much of the explanation for that. Bigger point, 75% of the code bases we look at have contain license conflicts. Now, those conflicts typically mean that the way the software is being used is in conflict with the license for the open source component that's contained. So the classic example would be, what most of these 75 are is some software that is to be distributed under a commercial license, and there's some GPL components in there. Not all of these issues necessarily require remediation. They all certainly require review. Different attorneys, different companies have different risk profiles. They may decide they're willing to live with some risk. But certainly in the vast majority of the code bases we look at, you really need a lawyer to look over these things to make sure you're comfortable with the level of risk that would come in an acquisition. So that's the discussion on what we're seeing in terms of licenses. I'm going to now turn it over to Mike, who's going to talk through different flavors of risk, specifically talking through risks of security vulnerabilities in open source components, and then operational risks.
Thanks, Phil. So as Phil indicated, when we look at these applications, a lot of times the attorneys are focused primarily on the risks associated with inappropriate licenses. But as you saw, if the customer in this case is only aware of about 45% of the components that they're using, there's also other risks involved with this, and the most common we see is a security risk from known vulnerabilities in those components. And in this sample set of 200 or so applications that we looked at, 2/3 of the applications had vulnerabilities in the open source components. So think of that. If you're using open source and if you're not tracking it carefully, chances are very good that you are including known vulnerabilities in the code that you're shipping or deploying. And this happens because, frankly, there are a lot of vulnerabilities being disclosed every day. Each year, the National Vulnerability Database tracks this. Each year, we see between 2,000 and 3,000 new vulnerabilities just through the National Vulnerability Database and just in open source components. And it's pretty steady. We're seeing 5 to 10 a day. There was a spike a couple of years ago after the Heartbleed disclosure when a lot of security researchers started looking more closely at not just OpenSSL, but a lot of different components. And open source really becomes the playground for security researchers. I mean, commercial companies aren't going to turn over their software to researchers to examine, but open source is out there for everybody, and you can see the code and you can do manual code reviews and so on. So in total, there were about 76,000 through the end of 2015 listed in the National Vulnerability Database. We were trying to figure out why automated tools weren't finding these, and went through to see how many of these referenced automated tools, and there were a total out of 76,063 common vulnerability enumerators, CVEs, were referenced automated tools. 50 of those were for vulnerabilities in the tools themselves. 13 of them, I can't remember the exact language, but it was something to the effect of it was a vulnerability that could be identified using a properly configured fuzzer. So let's dive down on into this a little bit more. The most common question we get when somebody...
Hey, Mike, could you describe what a fuzzer is? Because I think we probably have some folks who aren't familiar with.
Oh, sure. A fuzzer is a security testing tool. They can be automated or they can be run manually. And basically what they're going to do is send input to a field that is random and unexpected. So if you had a username and password field in a web application, it might throw 1,000 characters at it. It might throw SQL commands at it. So it's testing to see how the application reacts to what would be called a misuse case. So sometimes this can be done with a tool called dynamic analysis, but there are specific tools that are a little more specialty tools called fuzzers that a security researcher would use or a security tester might use in a penetration test. So the most common question we get is, geez, we're doing security testing. Why aren't we finding these? I'm using HP Fortify. I'm using IBM AppScan. I'm including the open source in there. Why aren't I finding these? And it's important to remember that while these tools are good, we use both static and dynamic analysis internally. They're specialized. So static analysis is going to typically look at the source code and build an intermediate representation, a model of that application by mapping out control flow and data flow and calculating what possible values of the variables could be and so on. And once they have that model, it does nothing by itself, but you can run rules against it. So I can look for an example of a string copy and then traverse the model to determine if it's possible, in that example, for the source buffer to be larger than the destination buffer. And if it is, that would be a potential buffer overflow. Dynamic analysis is, you might hear of as pen testing tools, so it's late in the development lifecycle when you have a application in a testing environment with data behind it and so on. And again, you would use fuzzing-like tools that would look for inputs and send what they would hope to be unexpected data to see if they can access information they shouldn't, escalate privileges, and so on. This black circle in the graph or in the slide here represents all possible weaknesses in software that could result in security vulnerabilities. This is something that's actually enumerated by NIST. They're called the CWEs, Common Weakness Enumerators. And we went through this exercise in the early days of Veracode. There were about 600 of them at the time. There are about 700 now. And we went through each one of those and said, theoretically, is it possible to find this weakness using static analysis or dynamic analysis or with a smart human? And we ended up with about, of the 600, there were probably 300 or so that you could find theoretically with static analysis, alike and overlapping number with dynamic analysis. But as you can see, there are a lot of these weaknesses in the black area that simply can't be found with these tools. There's still a role for a smart human being to go through and look at the code and identify these weaknesses manually. And even within those, they're not perfect. Each tool is going to be optimized to look for different classes of bugs in a better or worse way. Part of that overlap area in the Venn diagram here would be buffer overflow, SQL injection, really kind of common things. But Heartbleed was a buffer overflow. So theoretically, it should have been found by either static or dynamic analysis, but it was in the code base of OpenSSL for over 2 years. And I mean, how many times do you think that was tested? An application with OpenSSL tested hundreds, thousands, millions of times in that 2-year period, but none of the tools found it. It took a smart human being going in and looking at the code, seeing something that they thought was odd or squirrely, and then testing it until they could prove or disprove that there was a vulnerability. So it's not unusual that we're seeing these vulnerabilities, in particular if people aren't aware of all of the code that they're using. But it's also not something that can be safely ignored. About 40% of the vulnerabilities that we identified in these applications were either critical or high. So this is another international standard from NIST. It's called the Common Vulnerability Scoring System. We saw that they're ranked on a scale of 0 to 10, and 40% of these were a 7 or a higher. Now, to get to a 7 or a higher, what that means is you can see these circled areas here. It means the access vector is the network. So you don't have to have physical access to that machine in order to execute that or exploit that vulnerability. The access complexity is low, so it doesn't take a lot of skill to do it. There also might be a sample code, a sample exploit out in the wild for people. And then authentication, not required. So if something's going to be a 7 or higher, typically you're going to see that you don't need to authenticate to the box in order to exploit the vulnerability. It's not complex to do it, and you don't have to be on the same network. Now, even those companies that are tracking it, if you think about the logistics of this, it becomes difficult. If the average commercial application, at least what we've seen, has over 100 components, and there are 2,000 to 3,000 to 4,000 new vulnerabilities in open source every year, for a single application, that becomes difficult to track. If you've got an inventory of 10 applications or 100 applications, or some of our financial services customers, thousands of applications, it becomes very difficult, impossible to do manually. And while the National Vulnerability Database provides a source and a reliable source for vulnerabilities, it's by no means complete. There are 19 other certified numbering authorities, including Red Hat, Cisco, Microsoft, and so on, for both open source and for commercial software. But a lot of these just don't get reported. They'll go onto sec lists. They'll go onto these discussion threads and say, geez, I saw this problem with Drupal, with Apache Commons, with different components. And they won't bother to go through the process of submitting that to NIST, getting a CVE assignment for it, and so on. So you need to be, if you're going to be complete about this, you have to look at a lot of different sources for this information. And you've got to do so constantly, because the threat landscape changes so rapidly. Another thing we found here, we know that with 2,000 to 3,000 vulnerabilities, it might not be easy to track. Everybody knows about Heartbleed, so we figured everybody would have addressed that, because when Heartbleed came out, it was a fire drill for most companies. 11% of the applications we looked at had Heartbleed, the Heartbleed vulnerability. About 10% had Poodle and Shell Shock. So these are vulnerabilities that you didn't have to look in NVD for. I mean, this was in the news. It was on Good Morning America, for crying out loud. Everybody knew about Heartbleed if they were in the software development world or in the security world, and yet we're still seeing 2.5 years after Heartbleed was disclosed, applications coming across for our on-demand audits that include this vulnerability. So one of the other kind of cuts we took on the data was we assumed that some of these vulnerabilities might be there because maybe they were disclosed, just before we did the audit, and the company didn't have time to react, or maybe it was in a component that they had just brought in and hadn't looked at it fully. So what we did is we took a delta between the date of the audit and the date a vulnerability was disclosed if we found a vulnerability in an application. So to try to understand the age of that vulnerability from when it was disclosed to when we did the audit. On average, it was over 5 years prior to our testing. So these are vulnerabilities that have been out in the wild for years and years, and still we're seeing them in the applications. And this is important. Known vulnerabilities are really attractive to an attacker. And it's because there are a method of attacking that's called a non-targeted attack. So if there's a vulnerability in an open source component or some ubiquitous, commonly used component, I can build an exploit for that, and then rather than going after a bank or a retailer directly, I can just point that exploit at 1,000 random IP addresses and see which ones are vulnerable to this, and then go back in and dig into a little bit further. So I can see, first one's a local school, I don't care about that. Maybe the second one's a bank, and I do care about that. So I can go do a non-targeted attack. And as one of our customers said to me, if the NSA wants to get into my network, they're going to get in, and there's really nothing I can do about it. And I probably won't lose my job about it. But if there's a public vulnerability, a public exploit for a known vulnerability in my code, and I get hacked by a 16-year-old from New Jersey, I've got a big problem. I've got a reputation problem. I've got an employment problem. And this is the method that attackers take. This is why when you look at PCI, HIPAA, Sarbanes-Oxley, any of these regulatory standards, they say that you have to have awareness to vulnerabilities and patch within a specific period of time. PCI is very prescriptive about it. I think it's 30 days or 60 days that you have to patch. It's important to remember this applies to all installed software. It's not just commercial code. So if you have vulnerabilities in your own code, and those are the result of vulnerabilities in the open source components that you're using it, to comply with those regulatory requirements, you need to patch, and you patch early because there is a lag time between, or an optimal time, say, for when an attacker is going to attempt to exploit that.
Hey, Mike, did you agree with my off-the-cuff comment earlier about when a big company buys a smaller company that might make the assets of that new entity be more attractive just because they're now associated with a name brand company?
Yeah, I think that, you're seeing attackers try different tacks like that. I mean, if you look back at Target, for instance, they got in through the HVAC vendor. So if I were to, if I was a big company and I acquired some assets from a smaller company, I think it's a safe assumption that the application security maturity of that smaller company is going to probably not match up to what the larger company has. So there would be a window of opportunity to try to use that as an attack vector.
Yeah.
So as we talk about open source vulnerabilities, it's not that open source is more or less secure than commercial software, but there are characteristics about it that make it particularly attractive. I talked about the non-targeted attack. With open source, that's really nice because it's nice in a bad way, I guess. Here are the characteristics. Open source is ubiquitous. So we've seen that there are, on average, 100 open source components in a commercial application. This becomes a target-rich environment for an attacker. We go to the trouble of publishing the vulnerabilities in the National Vulnerability Database and in other locations. So we're telling the attackers that here's a weakness that can be exploited. Often that will come with an exploit to prove that the vulnerability is real. So the researcher who's found this has published the vulnerability or disclosed the vulnerability, disclosed the exploit as the proof, and so on. The attackers have access to the code because it's open source. So they can look at the code, they can modify that exploit to get around, kind of standard rules that might be in an intrusion detection system or web app firewall, that type of thing. If they're still confused, they can usually go on YouTube and find some examples of how to use any specific exploit. The biggest thing, though, is in the support model. So if we're using a commercial component in an application, we have a service level agreement, an SLA with the vendor. Right? So if we have a question on how to use that component, the vendor is obligated to answer that. If there is an update to it, they're going to push that to us. If there's a vulnerability, they're going to disclose that, push us a patch, or push us an update. Open source is really the exact opposite of that. If you don't have a commercial support agreement for an open source component, it's all on you. So you've elected to go to GitHub, SourceForge, the project homepage, and pull that component in and use it in your application. It's now your obligation to provide your own support for that. If there's a patch for that or a vulnerability, you don't find out about that. You have to go and make yourself aware of that. If there's an update, you have to look at the release notes, determine was it for a security issue Was it for functionality that you want or don't want? And then elect whether or not you're going to pull that in. So it's really a push versus a pull model. As we've seen, if you're not tracking what you're using, you're obviously not going to be making good decisions about that, and not patching what you should be patching. So it's just to emphasize, it's not an issue of you shouldn't be using open source or that open source is less secure. It's software, so it's going to have vulnerabilities in it. If you're not tracking it, if you're not tracking the ongoing health of those applications, you're inviting trouble. So what can you do? What we would ask that you do to see if you're covering this or not is talk to your development leads or talk to your security people and ask if they have a list of the open source components that are being used. And if so, how did they compile that list? How do they make sure that nothing has slipped through the cracks? If they have policies about what is allowable in the code, how are they enforcing those policies? And then more importantly, how are they tracking the ongoing health of those? When I talk to software developers about who's tracking the vulnerabilities in the code, they kind of assume that's a security issue and that the security team ought to be tracking new vulnerabilities and reporting to development. If I talk to the security people, they're under the impression that the development people have chosen to use these open source components and therefore naturally tracking for updates and security issues and so on. So make sure you have a process in place for that. The key takeaways from this, from a security standpoint and from a licensing standpoint, is there are a lot of different licensing, open source licenses out there, thousands in fact, and we've seen, Phil reviewed some of the most common ones, but make sure you know what's going into your code base, make sure you're having an appropriate legal review of these, and if you see some that might present a conflict, make sure that everybody's involved in that discussion to resolve any issues. Open source security is not covered by traditional tools, so we really encourage the use of static and dynamic analysis. As I mentioned, we use it internally. We partner with both IBM and HPE Security, but understand what they're capable of doing and what they're not capable of doing. They're really good at finding common coding errors in the code you write that can result in security vulnerabilities. What they've proven incapable of doing is finding even previously disclosed vulnerabilities in open source. These vulnerabilities like Heartbleed and shell shock and the 60 or 70 other vulnerabilities that were in OpenSSL since Heartbleed are simply too complex to be identified using these automated tools. So get involved early in the security development lifecycle with both security testing and open source testing, making sure you have appropriate policies and that you're enforcing those as you go on. Security isn't a permanent fixture. We talk about things like underwriters labs. They can test for electrical components. They can test that a coal mining lamp is intrinsically safe. That's physics. Software isn't physics. Software changes. So what we think is secure today can change overnight. And as the code base ages, new vulnerabilities are inevitable. So frequently check for these common sources like the National Vulnerability Database or other sources for new vulnerabilities, match that up to your code base. And finally, even if you don't think you're using open source, you are. If you're using any commercial software, as we've demonstrated today, the average commercial code base is over a third open source. And this is even a lagging indicator because these applications that we're looking at might be 5 or 10 years old. Newer applications are more likely to have a higher percentage. If you're not tracking it, you're obviously, if you're not tracking what you're using, you obviously don't have visibility into potential risks. So make sure that you have visibility for everything that you do.
So thanks, Mike. Mike did a good job of outlining what are key takeaways for someone managing software code. But in the context of M&A, if you're buying it, you haven't been involved in managing it at all. So you really need to get a sense for today what's the state of that code, And for all of those conceptual reasons backed up by the data that we've said, that we've looked at, it's pretty clear there's risks in most code bases. So you need to evaluate that, and that means determining, baseline requirement is what are the open source components in the target's code. Asking is a good idea, but as we said, even if the target can provide a list of open source components, it's probably only about half of what's actually in there. So it's pretty important to dig in further. We're biased, of course, because we do audits, but we would say any time that software assets are a significant part of the valuation of the deal, it's worth doing an audit. From that audit, you want to determine the license issues. For the most part, it all depends on what your intentions are for the use of this code. If it's going to be distributed, you're going to want to look for GPL and other reciprocal licenses. If it's SaaS and you're going to maintain it as a SaaS model, there are a smaller number of licenses that are problematic, but still well worth understanding. And in any case, you'll want to understand how well that target has done at managing the obligations, even if it's just the obligations of these very common permissive licenses to include the copyright statements. If they're not doing that, it's work to do it. It's not as hard as ripping out something from the foundations of the software and replacing it, but it's real work to make sure that you're complying with those licenses. And depending on your company's risk profile and philosophy towards complying with open source licenses, there may be a pot of work there that you should be aware about. Certainly, Mike made some compelling arguments, and backed up by the data we've seen that security and operational issues are really important to understand. In the same way that license issues can require remediation, certainly security issues can as well. And what you're really trying to do is get a sense for, all right, how many, is this a long list of problems or a short list of problems? And you probably need to get your technical folks talking to the target technical folks, going through the list and saying, all right, let's be realistic. What's it going to take to fix this stuff? And, I've had personal involvement in M&A transactions where a development organization was tied up for several months on a remediation effort. The other thing I'd recommend is understanding how well the target's been managing this stuff. And what I hear from a lot of M&A professionals is that given the pervasiveness of open source, if the target's not managing that aspect of software development very well, it may be indicative of poor management in other aspects of the software development lifecycle. So worth knowing about. And I'll put in a little plug for a blog that I published earlier this week. It talks about how you can, and it's supposed to be for not real technical people necessarily, but some simple questions that an investment professional could ask of a company to understand how sophisticated they are about managing open source. And Jenny, could we send that out in the link to that blog out in the follow-up?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll send you a link to it. But it talks through, and it links to a document we have that actually contains an actual checklist of 5 questions you can ask, and here's how to interpret those answers. I think you'd find that useful. On the other side, sellers. We find more and more sellers coming to us proactively. It's become pretty clear to anybody that's been around the block that open source issues or questions are going to come up as part of diligence. And so, savvy sellers are trying to get ahead of that. Again, take it with a grain of salt from the company that does audits, but we would certainly recommend, if you're very proactive, let's say you stepped into this company and your job is being part of readying that company to be acquired, say, a year. Understand that you'll get the question of what open source is in the code. So make sure there are processes in place to understand that. IP attorneys there are a number of them out there. Most of the big firms have some open source specialists. So you want to find somebody that knows open source well. And most open source specialist IP attorneys can advise you on what a reasonable policy would look like for your company and help you with your strategy and even process for managing it in an appropriate way. And it doesn't always have to be complex. If you've got 10 or 20 developers on the sell side, or if you're advising a firm with a smaller development team and everybody's in one place and it's a relatively new code base and you're just getting started, having somebody on staff who understands that stuff, having a very simple process of having to report to that person or get approval from that person to use a component, that's well beyond what many companies are doing. Maybe having an intern once a month going through the list and looking for new security vulnerabilities. It's not perfect, but it's far better than not doing anything, and better than most companies are doing today. If you don't have the luxury of having a year-long runway, but there's been some inbound interest, and there's likely to be a due diligence process coming up, we certainly recommend doing a Black Duck audit early as possible. Understand the issues, remediate. We can rescan and give you a clean bill of health, and now what could be a bunch of surprises and some negatives and some things to turn the discussion in a disadvantageous direction during diligence can now turn into a positive. So 2 cents from folks who are involved in a lot of transactions. I hope that's been helpful. Jenny, it looks like we've got a couple of questions. Or a couple of minutes. Do we have some questions? I guess is my question.
We do. So, again, everyone, feel free to submit your questions through the Ask a Question section. We already have some that were submitted through during the presentation. So, the first one is pretty simple. How important is it to address licensing issues? So, if you want to take that one.
Well, I guess there's no absolute answer. Companies have to be aware that there are issues and work with whoever worries about risk in the company, the CFO, the CEO, CTO probably, and I would say IP counsel. And if you've got in-house that can be helpful, that's great. But you may want to talk to outside IP counsel and just be aware and understand the risks. There are lawsuits, there are risks. You have to understand your profile. In general, I would say the minimum is you want to be aware of what risks you're taking on when you're buying a company, and how or whether you remediate them is really up to you and your risk profile. And but I would say what's irresponsible is taking on some software assets without having a sense for what those risks are.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that and the comment we made earlier, an attacker, they may be criminals, but they're rational human beings, and we joke about like the bad guys have quotas also. So the least amount of work that they have to do to have a successful attack is the path they're going to take. So if a new software asset to your organization is being brought in, and if an attacker believes that it's less likely that has received sufficient security diligence, that may be the simplest path to simplest route to an attack. And if it is, it's certainly if you think like a bad guy, it's certainly a rational approach to going after a specific target.
Thanks, Mike. Another question I have here is, it seems like we're seeing a lot more vulnerabilities within open source. Is it because open source is less secure than commercial components? Can you explain that? Maybe Mike is a question for you. Yep.
Yeah, sure. So I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that the NIST program is pretty well recognized at this point. So researchers who are identifying these vulnerabilities are reporting them. I think a bigger reason is that there are simply more people who are capable of finding these types of vulnerabilities than there were 5 or 10 years ago. I mean, somebody who could do a manual review of code for security 10 years ago was a highly specialized skill. There really weren't a lot of people outside of a company like At Stake or Sigil who could, or Leviathan, who could do this type of work. Today we're producing them by the hundreds every year. There are really good programs. People are getting more and more involved with it. So again, it's not a matter of whether open source is more secure or less secure. I think that can become a religious argument. But it is software, so it is going to have, or it's going to be subject to vulnerabilities.
Thanks, Mike. Question here, why should a person like me who resides on the legal side care about the vulnerabilities? Isn't that what the developers are monitoring? I don't want to take that one. I feel like both of you could take that. But
yeah, I can start with that. I mean, the developers aren't monitoring it. The developers are compensated for delivering functionality, specific functionality by a specific date. And it's not that they don't care about security, but if they're going to miss a release date, they're much more concerned about that. And frankly, a lot of companies are more concerned about missing a release date than they are about security, in particular if they're distributing software, because when they distribute the software, they also distribute the risk or shift the risk to the buyer of that software.
Yeah, I think that's right. And if our general counsel, Matt Jacobs, was here, he'd expound. Basically, his point would be all problems come to roost in the general counsel's office. So if you've got security vulnerabilities, what you're worried about is getting hacked and losing somebody's personal information or proprietary code or whatever, and general counsel's going to get pulled into it. So worry about it.
Great. I think we have time for one more question here. How does a distributor comply with the MIT license with open source software obtained by the distributor in source code form? Is distributed in object code form only? Must a copy of the license and copyright notices be included in documentation accompanying the software? For example, an end user manual or copyright notices within the manual?
Yeah, so great question for an attorney. I'm not one, but I will, I'll give you Phil's understanding. The MIT license is the simplest license, and the intent is to make it really, really easy to use. And the gist of it is you got to include attribution, leave the copyright in the source code, and include attribution being a copyright statement in if you're distributing object code, and I think there's one other element of it that says, and by the way, we're letting you use this for free. So, no warranty as is, don't come sue us. And basically you're agreeing to that by using the code. So that's my understanding of it. If you read it and you think there's ambiguity in the license, certainly there are, attorneys out there who are experts on open source software. And I think whenever you have a question about the specifics of what you would do with some code licensed under a particular license, I would say if you have any doubt in your mind, you ought to speak to somebody who knows what they're doing, who has a law degree, and not just a guy who's involved in this stuff as I am with an opinion. So I think that's it. Jenny, or I guess we're out of time.
Yeah, we have 1 minute to spare. Thanks for everyone for taking the time to listen to this webinar. I will be sending a follow-up email with Phil's blog, like you said. And if there's anything else I can help you with, feel free to reach out to me. Have a great day, everyone. And thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Jenny. Thanks, Phil.